So without further ado, we're going to get into the agenda for what today is going to look like. So the first thing we're going to look at is just the data that we are seeing currently with FAFSA completion. This also includes alternative application completion as well for the state of Illinois. We'll get into some updates that we're seeing just with the things that are going on, current open issues. We'll talk about things that your students can be doing right now, even while they wait with all of these delays. Then we'll talk about what happens after a student actually submits a FAFSA, as well as just some updates with verification and professional judgment, what a student might need to know with that in terms of this award year. And then we'll follow up with some resources specifically so that you all can feel better equipped to support your students as we near the end of this school year. So let's get into the data. We just want to make it clear to you all that this looks different than it has in previous years. And so it's not that for just the sake of increasing FAFSA completion that we want to do these webinars. It's really to show you that there are currently gaps as a result of the FAFSA delays and talk about how we're addressing those gaps, as well as just provide you all with some ideas for how you can better support some of these students so that they don't fall through the cracks. So currently, as it sits, we are at 56% for FAFSA completion in the state of Illinois, so throughout high schools. This number includes alternative applications, so we don't distinguish between the two just to protect students' information so that, you know, a counselor is not necessarily knowing, oh, this student filed an alternative app and this student filed a FAFSA. Yes, that's information you may have from your students, but for the sake of just completion rates, we don't distinguish between the two. It does include both of those applications within this number of 56%. So this is from last week. So we did this webinar last week as well. So we're giving you just updated numbers as we go. We're going to continue to do these throughout the month of May. And so this is about a 3.5% increase from last week's numbers that we have. So steadily increasing as we go from week to week in terms of FAFSAs that are able to be completed. This, of course, is a result of some of the changes that have happened over the last week for some of these students to be able to get in and actually file a FAFSA. So in terms of non-participation forms, we're at about 9%, just a little bit less in terms of how many students are filing a non-participation form, indicating that they do not intend to file a FAFSA. Maybe they don't plan to go to college. And so that is sitting at 9%. It's about a 2% increase. We're sitting at a little bit less than 7% last week in terms of how many non-participation forms were filed. So those two together, what we want to just address is that we're sitting at 35% of students within the state of Illinois who have not done either of these things. So the big piece of working with these students is we have to target these students and figure out what their plans are so that they don't fall through the cracks. And so that's really the point of working through all of these resources, is that we're not just trying to increase FAFSA completion just for the sake of FAFSA completion, right? Of course, we want students to have options, but that 35% has some kind of a plan after high school. And maybe we don't know what that is at this point. And so that's where we want to make sure that we're working with those students to get them to do either that non-participation form or file a FAFSA or alternative application. So that's where these numbers sit as of this week. And so you'll see that we will continue to update these numbers as we do these webinars throughout May and as these numbers change. So we want to also draw your attention, if you're not aware of the financial aid application completion performance metrics page. I know that is a mouthful, but this is where you can track just based on high school. So within Gap Access, your high school's data is going to be in that platform, but then we have a performance metrics page where you can see what other high schools are doing. And so the idea here is that you can search via, county, you can search via a specific school if you'd like to, but you're going to see the different rates that these schools are at for FAFSA completion, as well as their opt-out forms. So this number as well is going to include that alternative application number with the FAFSA completion number. Again, we don't distinguish between those two. But just note that that is going to be where you can track how other schools are doing. This is something that gets updated on a weekly basis. Within Gap Access, your numbers are going to get updated on a daily basis. But within the performance metrics page, you can see this on a weekly basis. It happens on Mondays to track this information. So just zooming in a little bit on what this data is going to be showing us is that, and you can search again, you can go by county, so you can see if you have, say, a school that is also in your city, or is a school that maybe you tend to have similar completion rates or just similar student populations, you can see that information side by side. But what we want to point out is that ideally these numbers, your opt-out percentage and then your FAFSA completion percentage, including those alternative applications, is going to equal 100% ideally. So of course, yes, this is a graduation requirement. And so if a student does not complete that FAFSA or alternative application, and then they're going to be directed to that opt-out form. And so you'll see here that we're at, with this first school, which we've just removed that information. We've looked at, okay, this school has 82% of their FAFSAs and alternative applications filed, and then we're at 0% for those opt-out forms. And you'll see that, you know, maybe later, farther down in a similar district, this is a school that only has 22% of their FAFSAs filed and 5% for opt-out. And so we're missing 73% of students that still need our support to figure out what it is that they're going to be doing after high school. You can also see, especially if you're looking within a district, that you can have vastly different numbers. And so it's important to recognize that you might need some additional supports in your school, from your community, from your ISAC core member, from us in general, to help you get those rates up so that those students are not falling through the cracks. So thinking about some of those things as you work with your students. So we want to get into just some updates for you all in terms of where the FAFSA is at with all of the delays. So our current timeline is looking like this. We've gotten over some hurdles here, and so as of mid-April, that's when that FAFSA corrections process was available, and so students were able to finally go in and make some of those corrections. We know that there were a lot of students that had corrections that had to be made. They had to submit the FAFSA in a certain way in order for it to even be processed in the first place, and so they were waiting on that corrections process to open in order to actually get their information processed accurately. Some students, they didn't know that they needed a correction until it opened in mid-April and they saw that there was some kind of an issue with their form. So nevertheless, that has been open since mid-April. The department did reprocess those FAFSAs and sent the institutional student information records, or ISRs, over to institutions, those ones that were affected by just the tax data issues. There were some issues with the information that was getting pulled over from the IRS. So that has been reprocessed, sent to schools, and then records, they had indicated a week ago that they had a plan, or a couple weeks ago, that they had a plan to send the records to colleges by starting by May 1. So that has been happening since we are now at May 10th. But we are still waiting on some information with paper FAFSAs. So I know we've gotten a lot of questions in the past about paper FAFSAs and whether or not this is the route to go for some students, just because there have been issues with getting the online form done. And so we just want you to be aware that's going to happen for paper FAFSAs. And it's why there have been changes with how the students are able to get into the online form and to process that way instead, because that is going to get processed before those paper FAFSAs do. Now, there has been an update for contributors without a social security number. So this is going to come as a relief to many, we hope. So there was an electronic announcement on April 30th of 2024. So just a couple weeks ago, that contributors who needed to get into the form. They were having some issues because of their identity being validated, verified. We know that that process has been delayed for many in terms of getting the documentation. We had heard everything from, just a few days to 25 days to people just waiting and waiting and waiting to get their identity verified. And until that was processed, a contributor who did not have a social security number could not get into the form to provide their information. And so that was providing a lot of delays for students who had a required contributor that did not have a social security number. So they did announce this electronic announcement that said that they were going to have just a temporary flexibility for contributors that didn't have a social security number to be able to go into the form, even if they didn't have that identity verified at this point. They were able to get into the form and start using those FSA IDs. Now, because this identity verification piece is tied to the IRS having that tax information and consent, that is something where contributors are still going to have to provide their information manually, their tax information manually. So just something to keep in mind is that that is a temporary fix for contributors who are required to report their information on the form and they don't have a social, to be able to get into that FSA ID to provide that information on their students' FAFSA. But they are going to have their information verified later, and then that will happen retroactively for them. So the department is going to be emailing individuals who are affected by this temporary change for them to be able to get into the form. We know that I have personally seen some students who are still waiting for some of this information to get verified and are struggling still to get in. And so, yes, this was something that had been announced, but just know that there might still be glitches that students are encountering, that we are aware of some of these things that are happening. So it's important to understand that with these processing delays, that it's a cycle that's going to just push all the rest of these things as one thing gets delayed. So it's kind of a domino effect in terms of, okay, the FAFSA, normally releases on October 1, and so it was pushed to the end of December, but really it wasn't open for a lot of students for a long time. And so that pushed the institutional student information records being sent to colleges. And so because the FAFSA was delayed, the ISERs were delayed. Because the ISERs were delayed as well, that meant that corrections and issues with the direct data exchange, that also prompted more delays, which meant that financial aid offers were going to be delayed as well. So for students, we know that many schools have sent out quite a few. We know some students are still waiting on financial aid offers. We know that some schools, the 12 public state universities, have pushed those deadlines, most of them to June 1, in terms of a decision day. But this is also going to push that process of appeals, professional judgment. If you have a student that is wanting to look at their financial aid offer and they really want to go to this school, but there is an issue with maybe being able to afford it, maybe there was a change in circumstance, they need some kind of an appeal, they need some kind of professional judgment for their case, that's also going to delay that decision for that student. So just to kind of give you a visual of how one impact is going to impact the entire process with these delays. So we want to take a minute to just talk about the FAFSA graduation requirement. So this is to complete a financial aid application. So whether that be the FAFSA or the alternative application, or to file a non-participation, you might also have heard it referred to as the opt-out form, to complete that in order to graduate from an Illinois public high school. So this is a requirement that is a few years old, and so we recognize that there have been extra challenges with that this year, that it has been challenging for students and families to get their FAFSA filed, and so many of them are kind of scrambling at this point, and you all might feel like you're scrambling to get this information from students and to have that just as a record for your school in terms of meeting that graduation requirement and being in compliance with it. And so we want to just make it clear that the intent behind this is that it is not to be a barrier to graduation. For students to still be able to graduate The intent behind this law when it was created was to get more students to file the FAFSA, because a lot of students weren't filing it and didn't know that they were eligible for a lot of need-based aid. And so we have some temporary flexibilities that we're going to go into now that are new to just help you all with this process, so that students are not going to be barred from graduating because they didn't file a FAFSA. So what we have now is an admin waiver. This can be for students who, because of issues with FAFSA simplification and the delays with that, whether they couldn't get into the form because maybe they had a parent who was a required contributor, didn't have a social, couldn't complete the FAFSA, or maybe just other glitches that they've been encountering with the form. There's something called an admin waiver now that can be granted to students who haven't been able to file. Or just, if you think about what we had before with the good faith effort, it's similar to this, but it's going to be a little bit more flexible for students. Just in terms of the good faith effort was for students who maybe you've made some efforts to talk with them about filing a FAFSA, filing an alternative app, completing the non-participation form, but maybe for whatever reason you contacted them, and it just hasn't worked. And so previously the good faith effort was for a principal to go in and mark those, document that information that they've tried to reach the student and it has not been successful, but that they've made a good faith effort, and that counts toward that compliance. This admin waiver now is kind of like an overarching concept for students who have been experiencing issues with FAFSA simplification, that the reasons behind this admin waiver being granted for them is because they experienced delays with FAFSA simplification. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail with what this looks like within Gap Access. And what that flexibility is going to look like for you all as counselors. But just know that if you have an admin account in Gap Access, you are able to grant the waiver. And I'll show you what that looks like toward the end when we get into resources. All right, so what happens after a student files a FAFSA? So they're going to get something called a FAFSA submission summary. So you might have previously known this as the student aid report, the SAR. It is the FAFSA submission summary now. So this is what the student will receive in terms of information that they provided on the FAFSA. So they'll get a summary of all of the answers that they provided, as well as their just basic information to decide if they are going to be eligible for federal aid. They're going to be able to see their student aid index, their SAI on here as well. And they will get a notification via email. They can go access it onto their studentaid.gov account. This is only once the FAFSA has been processed. So if you're logging in with a student to their studentaid.gov account and you see that their form is still processing or it's in review, just know that they won't be able to see this information until it has actually been processed for the student. So this is how you access it. The student is going to have to log into their studentaid.gov account. They're going to go to their My Activity page. So the My Activity page is going to show them the FAFSA status tracker, and then they're going to be able to see the FAFSA submission summary button below. Again, only if that application has processed. So this is a screenshot to just show you where the student would find that and what this will look like. They'll go ahead and click on it, and then they'll see some other options once they're inside of it. So there's 4 tabs. They'll see their eligibility overview. They'll see their FAFSA form answers, so anything that they provided on the form, as well as information about the schools that they sent their FAFSA to, and then any next steps. So if there's any action items that the student needs to do or just be aware of as their form has processed and been sent to schools, they will be able to see this information within all 4 of these tabs. So especially this estimated federal student aid tab, it's going to show them what they might qualify for in terms of a Pell Grant, in terms of loans. And so this screenshot is specifically for an independent student. So the loan amount is much higher than what you would see for a dependent student who would be pursuing, say, a bachelor's degree. So they can also get into their SAI information. This is where they'll see what that student aid index is. And so if they're not sure what SAI means, what a student aid index is, especially if, say, this is a returning college student, they're used to the terminology of their EFC. Explain to them that it is basically the same thing, it's just got new terminology, and that the range is a little bit different. So they might be seeing a different number than they're used to, especially if maybe they had a 0 EFC and maybe that now they're into the negatives for an SAI. So they'll be able to click and see what that number is for them, and it gives them a little bit of a description of how this number is used. I think especially before, when we had expected family contribution or the EFC, it was confusing for students to look at that number and see that as an amount that they would have to pay from their family, especially for families as well. So this SAI is going to indicate, hey, this is how we calculate your federal aid eligibility. Just to see if maybe you're eligible for a Pell Grant, or if you're eligible for those, maybe a need-based loan. So they can click into it. If they click this, what does this mean? Blue, it's hyperlinked. They'll get this, what is a student aid index? And it'll give them what the range can be in terms of what it means if you have a low student aid index or if you have a high student aid index, and how that will calculate that eligibility out. So that next steps tab, that was one of the 4 options that the student had to click on. So next steps, this is where it's going to let them know if they have any action items that they need to take. So now that the corrections process is available for students, this is where they'll go to make any corrections that they need to make, whether that's adding a signature if they weren't able to do that before, or if they need to make a correction based on, say, a school, or if they need to go in and there was something that they put in incorrectly the first time, right? That's something where they can go in and they can make that correction. It does also let the student know if there is some kind of significant change in their family, say that's the death of a parent, or a parent lost their job. That is something where it's not a correction, because it was true at the time of filing the FAFSA, but now it is no longer true, and that is a circumstance where the student is going to want to talk with the financial aid office and potentially get an appeal granted that will change their SAI, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But this is where they can see that information again once they're in that FAFSA submission summary. New is also the FAFSA student status tracker. So this is going to be for a student to see kind of just the dates that they submitted things, that things were processed. This is going to be on their My Activity page as well. And it's also going to show them where the FAFSA is in that processing cycle. So they'll say, okay, the FAFSA form has been started. You'll see that this student started their form on January 2nd. They submitted it on January 2nd. It was received, but it had not been processed until March 15th. And that was because of those processing delays. That yes, the form was open in January, but it did not process until March. So you'll see that this student has a processed form. You'll see that there's also no issues with it at this point. There's no corrections needed, no action steps that are needed for the student. There's also some other indications that the student could see. So the FAFSA status tracker might show them that their FAFSA is in draft mode. Maybe they have not completed their FAFSA. Maybe they're waiting on some information from, say, a parent, and so they need to still complete that form. It's still incomplete. If they see that it is in progress, I think we had a lot of questions when things were in progress versus in review. There were a lot of questions about what that meant. And so they've put out this nice graphic that will show you what it means if a student's FAFSA is in progress. So when it's in progress, they're looking at consent has been provided, approval has been provided, signature has been provided, but that it hasn't been submitted yet. So the student has done pretty much everything they need to do, but they still just have to get it submitted. So if that's the case, if a student has it in progress, just have them log in and go ahead and submit that form. If it's in review, that means it's been submitted, but it hasn't been processed yet. So they're still waiting on some information to actually process it. That doesn't mean the student needs to do anything, but that FSA is working on processing that. Now, if a student sees action required, that means that FSA has identified that there is some kind of issue, that there's consent missing, approval, a signature, say, from a parent is missing, or maybe there's some kind of correction that's needed for the student. So they're going to want to log in and see what that is and go in their next steps and make that correction. Process means it's processed successfully. No further action is required on the part of the student or the parent. And then closed would be if it was not submitted, that deadline to complete the FAFSA has passed at this point. So for corrections, a student is going to log in with their FSA ID. They'll just go to studentaid.gov. They'll go to that page where it says next steps. Now, if a dependent student wants to make a correction and they change anything about their parent's information, keep in mind that the parent had a separate section to complete. Now the parent needs to log in and they need to provide a signature for the changes that were made. So if there's some kind of correction that was made, just know that the student might need to have their parents still log in. And so if they're saying that there's kind of some action needed and that the form hasn't been processed yet, that could be the issue, that the student made some kind of change that needs a signature. Now, if the student did receive their FAFSA submission summary in the snail mail, they can correct it, sign it, and they'll be able to mail it to the address that is listed on the FAFSA submission summary that way instead. All right, let's get into verification and professional judgment, what that looks like for this year. The good news is there is not a ton of changes in terms of verification and professional judgment for this year. A lot of the changes that there are good changes in favor of the student, even with these delays. So FSA did say that there are no changes to what is going to be requested in terms of documents, as well as acceptable documentation for the 24-25 FAFSA year. So what you are used to as acceptable documentation is going to still be the case, and we'll go through what those documents are for some of the common issues that a student might encounter. The other thing is that there's a significant reduction in verification this year. So if a student is likely to get verified because, say, they had to enter that information in manually, yes, they're going to have to go through verification, but this is significantly reduced. So that just random selection significantly reduced because of those delays. If a contributor had their information and it was transferred by the IRS, they did the consent piece, it was able to get transferred automatically, that is not going to have to be verified by schools because it came straight from the IRS. If somebody had to manually enter that information, on the other hand, though, you're going to want to have them start requesting those copies of their tax return transcripts. So that is something that they can request from the IRS. You can do it online, via mail, via phone, to get those and start sending those into schools because they're going to get selected for that verification process. And that is likely what they're going to request as documentation. So having that in advance can be helpful for those students. So some examples of just acceptable documentation, again, has not changed from previous years. It is what you are used to if you've ever walked a student through verification. Some of the common things that are verified in this process are family size, number enrolled in college, identity. They want to verify that, or they want to verify that the student is intending to pursue education, that is the intent of this funding. So for family size, this is often just a signed statement, similar for the number enrolled in college and the identity or statement of educational purpose. For the family size, it could include the name, the age, the relationship of all of the people in the household to the student themselves. For the number enrolled in college, it could also have an institutional statement. And then for identity, it's this idea that they are going to pursue those educational purposes and say that they are intending to use that for school, but they might also have the photo identification for that identity piece as well. Other acceptable documentation, so for U.S. income tax paid, you're looking at a tax return transcript. There's also the tax account transcript. So this would be only if the student had an amended return or the parents had an amended return that was required. Those can both be requested on the IRS website as well. So those are those pieces that could be a good idea to start having those be requested for the student and parents if they had to manually enter that information. Sometimes schools will just request a signed copy of a tax return as well, rather than the transcript. So just something to keep in mind. For non-tax filers, you're looking at W-2s, maybe that verification of non-filing, or a signed statement that says that they weren't required to file, but that also shows what they did earn from working and what that was reported on the FAFSA. So they want to make sure that matches. Now, professional judgment, this has changed just a little bit again. There's some good changes for students in terms of how schools can grant professional judgment. So there are now two categories for professional judgment. It's no longer just this overarching kind of special circumstance. Now we're looking at special circumstances and unusual circumstances. The easiest way to just think about these as two different things is that special circumstances is any kind of money adjustment. So there's some kind of loss of income, the family size change, and so now the amount that the student is being required to pay, maybe their financial aid is just no longer matching up. So that's a special circumstance. So some kind of adjustment in that cost of attendance or in the FAFSA to impact the student's SAI. An unusual circumstance, this is relating to dependency. Okay, so any kind of adjustment with dependency because of some kind of circumstance for the student, that is an unusual circumstance. So they're now divided into those two categories. One big change too is that schools used to be able to just kind of have a policy where they said, we just don't do professional judgment. You know, that's something that we're just not going to consider. And so that is no longer something that they can just say as a blanket statement that they just have no professional judgment policy in place. They have to have some kind of policy in place. And they also have to have some kind of list, some kind of documentation on their website to show what kind of documentation might be required in terms of making some kind of appeal, going through some kind of professional judgment policy. So they do have to have some kind of policy in place, and then they do have to be transparent in terms of what kind of documentation is going to be accepted. So we do have just some examples of what those unusual circumstances would be versus special circumstances. So you might see a student who, say, is a victim of human trafficking. Maybe they were granted refugee status, asylum status. Maybe they don't know where their parents are. They have no way to contact them. There's some kind of neglect there. They've abandoned them, or there's some kind of estrangement. I can never say that word for some reason. Estrangement with the family, that could be an example of an unusual circumstance, or perhaps the student or the parent has some kind of incarceration. So those are going to be your unusual circumstances. Again, these are going to be dependency issues. Special circumstances focus on money. So if a parent lost their job, okay, if there was some kind of expense that was really, really large. I know I worked with a family once before that policy was in place of rejecting, of not being able to reject all professional development policies, where I worked with a student once where her mom had recently been diagnosed with cancer. And they all of a sudden had a lot of medical expenses that were not going to be able to be covered by insurance. The student was no longer able to afford school. Because it was taking again into account those prior tax year, and that information was no longer reflective of what the family was earning because the mom wasn't working anymore, but also that they had these medical expenses, and the school just was not accepting professional development or professional judgment. So that is an example of a special circumstance, again, relating to money, where there's going to be some kind of adjustment in the SAI or in the calculation itself, or again, in the cost of attendance to adjust that student's SAI to potentially qualify for more financial aid. This is not a guarantee. A student can request an appeal. The school can have some kind of policy in place. They can say what kind of documentation they request, but it is not a guarantee that the student is going to receive a decision in their favor, right? The school can still not grant that appeal or grant that professional judgment for the student. There's also a new piece with the 24-25 FAFSA of being a provisionally independent student. So this would be a student who has some kind of unusual circumstance. Maybe their parents, they truly don't know where they are. Again, maybe there's some kind of issue of neglect. They have no contact with those parents, where a student is not going to be able to provide that parent information on the FAFSA. Especially with it being broken up into those two parts now, where maybe the student doesn't even have the availability to contact them, to have them fill out that section. Or maybe it's an environment where they don't feel safe, right? So there is this option now to file as a provisionally independent student, and this is going to be to submit the FAFSA without that parent information. It's going to indicate to the financial aid office, hey, the student is filing as provisionally independent. There's some kind of other thing that needs to happen here, but it wasn't necessarily just this accident, right? So the student would be going through the form, and they're going to see this question that asks them if they believe they qualify for one of the unusual circumstances, and it will list them out. And if they say yes, they're going to file as provisionally independent. So that will hopefully avoid students accidentally filing as provisionally independent, because it will ask if they have one of those unusual circumstances. If they don't, they're going to be told that they have to provide parent information. The school's financial aid office, they do have that final say. So it's similar to professional judgment and to appeals. This falls in that same vein, that the student is not guaranteed this. The school has that final say, but it does give some kind of indication to the school on their end. And then the student also is going to be instructed to contact the financial aid office so that they have that communication in place as well, so that hopefully there's no miscommunication about what needs to be done in order for the student to get that dependency override. There's a change as well with the determination for unaccompanied and homeless youth. So if you are working with a student who is experiencing homelessness and they are unaccompanied, so the FAFSA, if you're not aware, has a requirement for a student in order to be considered independent. They have to meet both prongs of this. So they have to be unaccompanied, meaning not in the physical custody of their parent or guardian, and they have to be experiencing homelessness. So the extension here is that the determination is expanded. So it used to just be just a few people that could provide this determination, but it has extended to a few more. So we've got our homeless district liaison, the director or designee. There used to be a few of these that were already included, but it has expanded to include all of these things, including a TRIO designee or director. So if you're thinking about your students who maybe are in a TRIO program, who maybe feel close with those people who are the director of that TRIO program, that could be somebody who's close to the situation of the student and is able to grant that determination on behalf of that student that yes, this is a student that is experiencing this, and I believe that they should be independent. The financial aid office can also grant this. So there's a couple different things that would happen with this depending on the school, and we're going to get into that here in a second on the next slide, but just know that the financial aid office can also grant this determination. So a couple changes for colleges, especially in terms of a dependency override, is that if a financial aid administrator at a previous school, so if the student transfers, if they were granted a dependency override, if they had some kind of determination, so that financial aid advisor or financial aid administrator piece from the previous slide, if they had some kind of documentation that granted that independent status, that can be accepted at another college. It's not necessarily has to be accepted, but just know that a college can accept that if another financial aid administrator said that this is a student that should be independent. If a student is going to stay at the same institution and they have been deemed independent for financial aid purposes, right? Specifically because they went through those questions and they were independent, or maybe they went the provisionally independent route, right? If they went through the process with their financial aid office of going through that documentation, they have been considered independent, they will not have to submit that information every single year thereafter. Again, only if they're staying at the same institution. That's not to say that a college couldn't accept that information, because that is another change. But if they're staying at the same institution, they will not have to provide that information every year. They will be considered independent for the rest of those award years for that student. So we have some recommendations that we just encourage you to be aware of and working with your students. We know the end of the school year is near, and we also have some resources for students over the summer, just as we do wrap up the school year. One big thing is just encourage your students to gather whatever kind of documentation they might need as soon as possible. So if you know that a student had to have their family enter their taxes manually, have them get those tax return transcripts so that they just have it waiting when a student or when an institution is likely going to call on them for verification. Have them be just keeping up to date with, say, their student portal, with their email, just to see if schools are trying to contact them in terms of getting that information in for verification. A student might not know that they've been selected for verification unless they are checking that information. The other thing, especially with verification, is if a school is requesting documents to only submit what has been requested. If a student submits more than is requested, they're going to have to verify all of the documentation, and that can take longer. So it is important that a student is just submitting what's been requested from the school. Yes, they can gather information early, right? The acceptable documentation has not changed, so a student has an idea of what they might need, but some of those things like signed statements, that might be something that the school provides that the student needs to fill out. So just submitting what's been requested. We encourage students as well to keep copies of everything. So just so that they know what they have submitted to the school, just so that there's no miscommunication. Everyone's kind of on the same page with that. And then ask questions. I know sometimes for students, it can be overwhelming because, especially if this is a new process, especially if they are a first generation college student and they don't know what this process looks like, it can be overwhelming to know what to ask. And so you all as college access professionals can work with students to help them understand what kind of questions they should be asking so that they can feel better equipped when they do ultimately enroll in college in the fall. So we're going to go through just some resources for you all to feel a little bit better equipped to support your students, but also to show you what kind of resources we'll have available. So the Financial Aid Application Completion Initiative, this is that piece where I want to talk about the admin waiver, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail on the next slide so that you can see what that will look like. But this, if you're not aware of it, this is what gap access is going to look like on the inside. It's where you all as high schools are able to track FAFSA data, alternative application data, again combined, and the opt-out waiver within gap access. So the gap access stands for the gift assistance program. That is where you can track all that information. It's where we house all of our gift assistance programs as well. If you are wanting to download this roster, that's something that you can do just so that you have it for your records in terms of the compliance with that FAFSA graduation requirement of having all of your students complete one of those things. So in a little bit more detail, and I just want to make you aware that I know this is small, I know it's a little bit hard to see, you'll be able to see this information within your gap access, but there is an option if you want to zoom in above the screen where the PowerPoint is being shown. You can zoom in, click that plus button. That is only going to affect your screen, so it's not going to affect anyone else's, so feel free to zoom in anywhere you need to just to be able to see this information. So it's important to know that you have now the option to do this admin waiver. So that is going to be that one on the far right-hand side of that first box. So you'll see that you can select, so you can select multiple at the same time. For students, you can select that they completed that waiver. That's going to get auto-populated from the student portal when a student completes it online. So that is actually grayed out on gap access because that will get auto-populated. On the other hand, though, if you have a student that completed the paper waiver, if they had some kind of circumstance where they had to request that from ISB, that is something where you can check that there to keep track of it. And then this new box here, again, that right-hand side of that first red box, it says admin waiver FAFSA simplification. So this is that new piece here where you can select multiple students without having to go in and put a reason for each one saying that we're doing this good faith effort, that we tried to reach this student, right? FAFSA simplification, we will know that that is the reason. The delays with FAFSA simplification is the reason, so that students are not barred from graduation. So you can select multiple students. Again, anyone that has an admin account is able to do this. The other thing I just want to draw your attention to is on the other red box there, the right-hand side. This is where you'll see what the status of the student's FAFSA is. So for this one, you'll see no FAFSA filed. So this is going to indicate that gap access has no record of a FAFSA being filed for that specific student. This could indicate a few things. It could indicate that there really was no FAFSA filed. It could also indicate, though, that the student, especially if they're coming to you to talk about their FAFSA, maybe they show you that they have submitted and had their FAFSA processed. that indicates to us that there's some kind of mismatch in terms of information on gap access. So the student for their FAFSA had to use their legal name on the FAFSA because it would have matched their social security number. So for me, my legal name is Elizabeth, but I go by Beth. And so if in my high school's information, if you had Beth for me, that is not going to match. And so I'm going to show up as having no FAFSA filed. So that's something where you can go in with your school information and update that so that there is going to be a match. Again, this information is populated on a daily basis that we get that from FSA. You'll see that on a weekly basis. So just something to keep in mind that that information does get processed daily here. You might also see students who will say FAFSA filed, no SAI. There's some kind of issue there. That's what that indicates to us, that maybe they need to make a correction. Maybe there was no signature that was provided. And so that's something where you want the student to go in and figure out kind of what that issue is that's making it so that they don't have an SAI that's been calculated. So the nice thing with this admin waiver, again, you saw that those boxes, you could select multiple students at the same time. This does take the place of having to document out each one of those good faith efforts. And you'll be able to grant this, again, if you have an admin account within Gap Access, you can select multiple students. That reason just being FAFSA simplification, we will know on our end that that is the reason for the students. So again, that they're not barred from graduating. So one other thing with the admin waiver is that we encourage you to share information with the student. If the student has an admin waiver that you have selected for them, again, to make it so that they're not barred from graduation, we are encouraging you to provide this information with the student. So essentially it is letting them know that they have had an admin waiver submitted for them on their behalf. And that if they didn't file a FAFSA or an alternative application, say maybe they still intend to, that is something where we are encouraging them to sign up for our isac.org/connect so that they can just get more information from us. It's a really simple form. They are going to get sent to this page here. So this is essentially signing up for our ISAC Q&A service. So ISAC Core College Q&A is going to connect them with a real life person anytime they text in, that they will get, not only they can ask questions via the ISAC College Q&A, but it's also going to allow them to get just regular updates about, hey, the new FAFSA has opened, it's time to file, right? So this is going to help them ensure that they have that support over the summer, especially as school is ending, just so that if they do still intend to file a FAFSA or an alternative application, there was some kind of issue, that they have some kind of way to contact us. They can work with an ISAC core member. We work all year round, so we are happy to support students over the summer so that they have the opportunity to get to college in the fall. So they're just going to put their name in. They're going to put their phone number in. I know you can't force students to fill out this form, but this is really going to help them if they do still need that support from us to file the FAFSA or an alternative application. So speaking of that year-round help, we do have the ISAC core. If you are not familiar with the ISAC core, most of my team members were former ISAC core members. So we worked within the schools throughout the state of Illinois to work with counselors, to work with students, to support them in the college going process. So anything in that process, we often did a lot of FAFSAs, but we did anything from college applications to helping them proofread essays maybe for an application itself, to again those FAFSAs. This year it's been a lot of FAFSAs, but we do have core members throughout the state who are able to help you with this process, help you kind of find those students who are in that 35% that haven't done either, right? Haven't done the FAFSA and also haven't done the non-participation form throughout the state of Illinois, to work with them one-on-one, work with families. They can also do workshops. It's not just limited to one-on-one help, but to help your students get this done so that they can graduate and also so that they can enroll in the fall. So if you want to go to the student portal, you can find your ISAC core member by zip code. This is also something you can share out with your students so that they know that they can contact that core member. We have them broken down by community college district. So that does not mean that the core member works with the community college or for the community college, but it means that it's for that area. So any student that would be going to that community college potentially, they're going to be able to support that student in that area and all those area high schools. So the ISAC College Q&A, this is what that form is going to direct the student to sign up for. So this is where, again, they can text with a real person. So it's during business hours. They do their best to respond, especially in busy FAFSA season, to people outside of those hours. But it is with a real person, so it's not going to be a bot that the student is talking to. So they're going to get some real answers that are going to support them in the financial aid and college going process. But again, this is also where they're going to get the just automated messages sent to remind them to do certain things in the college going process, especially if they are a returning applicant. So we highly, highly encourage all your students to sign up for this, especially those students who are still struggling. They're still in that spot where they haven't filed anything and they need some additional support and school is ending. Encourage them to do this because this will run all summer, all school year. And core members will be able to support them throughout the summer. So the way that they'll get started is they'll just text their first and last name to either of these numbers if they're looking for the English line or the Spanish line. We do have 2 lines for that are answered in those languages. The ISAC student portal is another great place to get information. And so that Find Your Core Member place is also on the student portal, but this is a place where students can go and compare their financial aid offers. They can get support from the ISAC core. They can play fun little games that will help them with money management, will help them with their financial aid knowledge. But it's a great place to just connect them with a lot of different resources. This could be another thing to share out with your students as the summer nears and as they need some additional support over the summer. To connect them with the student portal. These little postcards, you can order them from us for free. There's an order materials page on our ISAC website where you can have these shipped to your school for free, and you can share them out with your students, with your parents, so that they have this information in a convenient way. We also have electronic versions if you want to send out like an email blast. The First Gen Scholars Network, this is available on our student portal as well. So if you have students who are first generation college students and need that additional extra support to figure out this process, especially with these delays, we encourage you to have them join our network. This is to connect them with other first generation students across the state, but also with a first gen mentor through our ISAC core that is specifically working with first gen students. But it's also an opportunity for check-in events and for students to find out if there's some kind of campus program for them where they're planning to attend school. And this is free. So we encourage students to sign up for it. We encourage you to push this out to your students so that they're aware of these opportunities. We have the FAFSA communication toolkit. So this is another resource that we have put out recently. If you are doing your best to communicate with families about completing the FAFSA, we have just ways to connect with them. So we have email forms, just templates. We have flyer templates. We also have examples of robocalls that you could send in English and Spanish, a script for that, an email to say a volunteer if they're going to help with a workshop, and then those social media posts in English and Spanish as well. So that is available on our ISAC page as well, just for you to be sharing out this information in as many ways as possible to reach those students. We want to draw your attention to the open issues page. So just to make you aware that this is where FSA puts current issues as well as workarounds for those current issues and any issues that have been resolved. So it is now in categories, just to give you an idea that there are quite a few on here. So they're in categories of issues with the form itself, issues with the FAFSA submission summary, issues with the corrections process, and then resolved issues. So if you're encountering some kind of problem with your student's FAFSA, this is a good place to go to see if maybe there's a workaround or if it's just potentially a new glitch that's happening that just requires some time. We also offer professional development. So our team is in charge of professional development across the state. So if you would love to learn about maybe upcoming webinars, or in-person trainings that we're doing, we will put that out on our PD page, but we'll also put it out via e-messaging. But if you want to request some kind of training, this is free for college access professionals. We can do that as well. So this is what that form looks like. We ask that you submit that and we'll get someone assigned to it. We can talk about financial aid. We can also talk about specifically working with, say, special student populations, students experiencing homelessness, undocumented students. But we also put out a ton of other trainings like this one, just to try to be timely with the information that is currently coming out with all of the changes with the FAFSA. So this is another new resource that we have recently launched. It's the ISAC Connection, specifically for college access professionals. So we have the ISAC Core College Q&A, which is for students and parents. That's that texting line that we were talking about before with the admin waiver. This is for you all as professionals. So if you have a question, you can contact our professional development team via that number on the screen there, that 847 number, and we will be able to get those responses to you, again, texting with a real person during those business hours as best as we are able to do that. And then if you have other specific questions, you can feel free to email our training account. You can email me personally as well. Or if you have other training requests, you can submit that form, or you can email us as well to talk about what that might look like. If you have questions about e-messaging, we encourage you to sign up for that, just because that's where we put out all of our information, as well as our ISAC PD page. We put out other trainings that are coming up. We have a calendar there where you can sign up for more trainings, whether that's in person or virtual, and we will announce those via e-messaging as well. So my colleague Manny has just opened up the chat and put in the survey link. You can access it. It's the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. That little chat icon, you can click on the SurveyMonkey link there, or you can use the QR code that is on the screen just to provide feedback for today's session. Whether you are requesting CE hours or PD hours, we still encourage you to submit an evaluation just to let us know if you found this useful, what kind of things you would like to see from us in the future. But you also are required to submit it if you are requesting those continuing education hours or professional development hours. If you are requesting PD hours, you must provide your Illinois Educator Identification Number, your EIN, or we will not be able to grant those to you. We will follow up via email, so just give us a little bit of time to get those out to you once this survey does close. So the survey will close on Tuesday, May 14th at 4:30, so you do have until then to get that in. And then again, once that closes, we'll take a little bit of time to get those processed, and we'll send them out via email to you all that submitted them. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. If you do have questions that come up, you can always reach out to the professional development team at our ISAC training email. And then again, if you have not signed up for e-messaging, highly encourage it. That is where we send out so much information. We're not going to spam you, but we will send out just information that we feel like would be valuable to you all as college access professionals. So thanks again for joining us this morning. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out.